The first snowflakes of October drifted past Neil Jordan's office window on the 15th floor of the Frontier building, each crystalline fragment catching the pale afternoon light before dissolving against the glass. He barely noticed them, his attention focused instead on the quarterly financial reports spread across his desk like accusations of normalcy in a world that had begun to feel anything but normal. The emergency broadcast had been playing for 3 hours straight on the radio tucked beneath his monitor, but the words still felt surreal, disconnected from reality like dialogue from a disaster movie he'd accidentally left running in the background. Mandatory evacuation of Providence Hospital has been extended to include all medical facilities in the Anchorage metropolitan area. Unknown pathogen showing rapid transmission rates. Citizens are advised to exercise extreme caution and avoid contact with affected individuals. This is not a drill. Neil rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock. 4:30 in the afternoon, and the October sun was already beginning its descent toward the Chugach Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. The streets below should have been filled with evening commuters heading home to their families, but instead they were clogged with emergency vehicles, their red and blue lights creating a chaotic light show against the gathering dusk. He counted 7 ambulances in just the past 10 minutes, all racing toward the same destination with their sirens wailing like electronic banshees announcing the end of the world. Across town at Willowcrest Elementary, 8-year-old Danny Martinez pressed his small face against the cold classroom window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the same parade of emergency vehicles race past on Northern Lights Boulevard. His teacher, Mrs. Chen, had stopped pretending to conduct normal lessons hours ago and now sat at her desk, frantically scrolling through her phone with growing worry etched across her usually calm features. The other children had been picked up one by one throughout the day, until only Danny and his best friend Jules remained, 2 small figures in an empty classroom that felt more like a tomb than a place of learning. "My mom works at the hospital," Jules whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of sirens. "She was supposed to pick me up an hour ago. She's never late. Never." The 10-year-old girl's dark eyes were wide with a fear that seemed too mature for her age, as if she somehow understood that the world outside these walls had fundamentally changed in ways that adults were still struggling to comprehend. Danny reached over and took her hand, a gesture of comfort that felt inadequate against the growing weight of uncertainty. "Maybe she's just busy," he offered, though his own voice betrayed his doubt. "Maybe she's helping people and lost track of time." But even as he spoke the words, he could see more ambulances racing past, and something deep in his 8-year-old intuition told him that whatever was happening at the hospital was far worse than anyone was willing to admit. At Providence Hospital, the epicenter of the unfolding nightmare, Dr. Sarah Caldwell stripped off her bloodied scrubs for the 4th time that day, her hands shaking not from exhaustion but from a growing horror that threatened to overwhelm her 15 years of medical training. The patients in the newly established isolation ward weren't responding to any treatment protocols she knew, their conditions defying every principle of medicine she'd learned during her residency at Johns Hopkins. Worse still, 3 of them had died during her shift and somehow, inexplicably, returned to a state that couldn't be called life but certainly wasn't death. The first had been Mrs. Patterson, a 73-year-old grandmother who'd been brought in with what appeared to be a severe case of flu. She'd expired at 2:47 p.m., her vital signs flatlining as Dr. Caldwell performed CPR with desperate determination. The time of death had been officially recorded, the body covered with a sheet, and the paperwork begun. But at 3:15 p.m., Mrs. Patterson had sat up on the gurney, her eyes vacant and clouded, and attempted to bite the orderly who'd come to transport her to the morgue. The bite marks on Tommy Rodriguez's forearm were already showing signs of infection, the the same black veining that had appeared in the other patients before their conditions deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery. The second resurrection had been Mr. Chen, a middle-aged accountant who'd been rushed in after collapsing at his downtown office. His revival 20 minutes after death had been witnessed by 3 nurses and a security guard, all of whom were now in quarantine after being exposed to his attempts to feed on living flesh. The third had been a teenage girl named Sarah, barely 16, who'd been brought in by her parents after she'd attacked her younger brother at home. Her parents were still in the waiting room, demanding answers that Dr. Caldwell simply didn't have. The medical staff was calling it a virus, but Dr. Caldwell had studied virology extensively, and this didn't behave like any pathogen she'd encountered in literature or practice. The progression was too rapid, the symptoms too severe, and the post-mortem activity was simply impossible according to everything she understood about human biology. Yet here she was, watching the impossible unfold in real time as more patients arrived every hour, their conditions ranging from early-stage infection to full systemic failure. The city's emergency response system was already showing signs of strain. Police and fire departments were operating at maximum capacity, responding to calls that ranged from domestic disturbances to reports of violent attacks that defied explanation. The 2 main arteries leading out of Anchorage, the Glen Highway running north toward Palmer and Wasilla, and the Seward Highway stretching south toward the Kenai Peninsula, were already clogged with vehicles attempting to flee the city. But unknown to the thousands of residents trying to escape, military units were already setting up checkpoints at key locations, preparing to implement a quarantine that would effectively seal Anchorage off from the rest of Alaska. At City Hall, Mayor Richardson was huddled in an emergency meeting with the city council, the police chief, and representatives from Elmendorf Air Force Base and Fort Richardson. The federal government had been in contact for the past 6 hours, providing updates on similar outbreaks reported in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. The pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear. Major urban centers were experiencing simultaneous epidemics of what officials were calling aggressive behavior syndrome, though the euphemistic language did little to mask the reality of what was happening. "We're looking at a complete breakdown of civil order if this continues," Police Chief Martinez warned, his usually steady voice cracking with strain. "My officers are reporting attacks by individuals who appear to be deceased, exhibiting superhuman strength and an apparent immunity to pain. We've had to use lethal force in 17 separate incidents, and in each case, the subjects required multiple gunshot wounds to the head to be neutralized." The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. This wasn't just a medical emergency or a public safety crisis, it was something that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of reality. Outside the conference room windows, they could see smoke rising from several locations across the city, evidence of fires that were either accidents caused by the chaos or deliberate acts of destruction by those who'd lost their minds to whatever was spreading through the population. By evening, the quarantine was in effect. Military personnel had established checkpoints on both highways, turning back thousands of vehicles and informing desperate families that no one would be allowed to leave Anchorage until the situation was contained. The official explanation was that the epidemic needed to be prevented from spreading to other communities, but those trapped within the city limits were beginning to understand a more terrifying truth: they were on their own, cut off from the outside world with no guarantee that help would come or that they would survive whatever was transforming their neighbors into something inhuman. The radio broadcasts continued throughout the night, but the tone grew increasingly desperate as reports came in from across the city. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and the medical facilities were completely overwhelmed. Providence Hospital had been evacuated after patients began attacking staff, and the other hospitals were reporting similar incidents. Emergency services were struggling to respond to the growing number of calls, and several fire stations had gone silent entirely. As the sun set over Anchorage on what would later be remembered as the last normal day in the city's history, Neil Jordan finally left his office building and stepped into a world that had changed irrevocably. The streets were filled with abandoned vehicles, their doors left open as occupants fled on foot toward destinations that no longer existed. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of distant screams, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, shapes moved with purpose that was no longer human. Anchorage, Alaska's largest city and the gateway to the last frontier, had become the epicenter of humanity's darkest nightmare, and for the nearly 300,000 residents trapped within its borders, the fight for survival was just beginning. The outbreak spread through Anchorage like wildfire, consuming dry timber, each new infection creating exponential growth that overwhelmed every system designed to protect the city's residents. By dawn of the second day, downtown Anchorage resembled a war zone abandoned by its armies, with abandoned cars lining every street like metallic corpses and their doors flung open as occupants had fled on foot carrying whatever they could grab in their final moments of panic. The lucky ones had made it to the emergency shelters established at the high schools and community centers, though even those sanctuaries were proving inadequate against the relentless spread of whatever had transformed their neighbors into creatures driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh. The unlucky ones had become part of the growing horde that shambled through the streets with movements that retained just enough human characteristics to be deeply unsettling. They moved in loose groups, drawn together by sounds and scents that their damaged minds could no longer fully process, their eyes vacant and clouded but still containing enough intelligence to hunt systematically through the urban landscape. Their numbers grew with each passing hour as more people succumbed to the infection, and their collective presence transformed familiar neighborhoods into hunting grounds where the living had become prey. Neil Jordan had spent the longest night of his life barricaded in his office building, using furniture to block the doors and watching the city transform below his 15th floor window like a god witnessing the end of the world. The emergency broadcasts had continued sporadically throughout the night until they'd stopped entirely around 4 a.m, leaving behind only static and the occasional burst of panic chatter from emergency services who were clearly operating beyond their capacity and training. He'd watched fires bloom across the city like deadly flowers, their orange glow reflecting off the low-hanging October clouds and creating an apocalyptic skyscape that would have been beautiful if it hadn't represented the death of everything he'd known. When he finally ventured down to street level as the sun rose over the Chugach Mountains, Neil carried only a backpack hastily filled with bottled water, energy bars, and a first aid kit from the office break room, along with a desperate plan to reach his sister Rebecca's house in South Anchorage where he hoped to find safety and answers. The elevator had stopped working sometime during the night, probably when the power grid failed, so he took the stairs, 15 floors of echoing concrete in growing dread as the sounds from the street grew louder with each descending level. The lobby of the Frontier building had been transformed into a scene from a nightmare. The security desk was overturned, its glass surface shattered and stained with what looked like blood, and the massive windows facing 4th Avenue had been smashed inward, leaving jagged teeth of glass that caught the morning light like crystalline warnings. 3 bodies lay sprawled near the entrance, their positions suggesting they'd been running when they fell, and the dark stains around them indicated they hadn't died peacefully. Neil forced himself to look away and focus on reaching the rear exit, stepping carefully around debris and trying not to think about what might have happened to Marcus, the night security guard who'd always greeted him with a smile and updates about his grandson's baseball games. Dr. Sarah Caldwell had abandoned Providence Hospital when the military quarantine of the facility failed catastrophically around midnight, with soldiers in full hazmat gear being overwhelmed by patients who'd died and returned with strength that defied medical explanation. She'd witnessed too many good people die and return as something else, their personalities erased and replaced by a singular drive to feed on the living. Her medical bag contained the last of the morphine and antibiotics she'd been able to grab during her escape, but she doubted traditional medicine would matter in this new world where death had become a temporary inconvenience rather than a final destination. The drive from the hospital to her apartment had been a nightmare of blocked roads and abandoned vehicles, with infected individuals wandering aimlessly between the cars like lost souls searching for something they could no longer remember. She'd been forced to abandon her Honda Civic 6 blocks from her destination when the road became completely impassable, and she'd made the rest of the journey on foot, her medical training helping her move quietly and avoid the attention of the creatures that had once been her neighbors and colleagues. Her apartment building had been compromised, with infected residents roaming the hallways and stairwells, so she'd kept moving, looking for somewhere safe to rest and plan her next move. She was heading toward the downtown area, hoping to find other survivors or at least supplies, when she heard the sound of children crying from Willowcrest Elementary School across the street from a small medical clinic where she'd done volunteer work. The building looked intact from the outside, its windows unbroken and doors still closed, but the sounds of distress coming from within suggested that someone was still alive inside and in need of help. Every instinct told her to keep moving, to prioritize her own survival over unknown risks, but 15 years of medical training and basic human decency made the decision for her. Danny Martinez and Jules Thompson had been forgotten in the chaos of the evacuation, two small children lost in the shuffle as panicked parents grabbed their own offspring and fled into the growing nightmare outside. Mrs. Chened stayed with them as long as she could, but when the first infected broke through the school's main entrance around 10 o'clock the previous evening, she'd made the agonizing decision to barricade the children in a supply closet and lead the creatures away from their hiding place. Her sacrifice had saved their lives, but it had also left them alone and terrified in a world that no longer made sense. They'd been huddled together in the dark supply closet for over 10 hours, listening to sounds they didn't understand but instinctively feared. The shuffling footsteps that moved through the hallways with no apparent purpose, the low moans that seemed to echo from empty classrooms, and occasionally, the screams that cut through the October air like ice picks driven into their young hearts. They'd shared a single bottle of water and a package of crackers that Mrs. Chen had left with them, rationing the meager supplies while trying to comfort each other with whispered stories and half-remembered songs their parents had sung to them in happier times. Jules had cried herself to sleep several times, only to wake with fresh tears as reality reasserted itself. Her mother worked at Providence Hospital, and the last thing she'd heard before the world went crazy was that the hospital was in lockdown. Danny had tried to be brave for his friend's sake, but at 8 years old, he was struggling with fears and responsibilities that no child should have to bear. They'd heard voices in the hallways several times, but they'd learned to distinguish between the meaningless moans of the infected and the purposeful speech of the living, and most of what they'd heard belonged to the former category. When Dr. Caldwell found them, following the sound of muffled crying through the eerily quiet school building, they were dehydrated and terrified but miraculously unharmed. The supply closet had protected them from the infected who'd wandered through the building, creatures that seemed to hunt primarily by sight and sound rather than smell. She'd approached their hiding place carefully, speaking softly to identify herself as a friend and a doctor before coaxing them out of their sanctuary. The relief in their young faces when they saw another living human being was almost enough to break her heart, but it also strengthened her resolve to keep them safe. Neil stumbled into the school looking for shelter and supplies when his route to South Anchorage proved impassable, blocked by overturned vehicles and roving groups of infected that seemed to be growing more organized as their numbers increased. He'd been moving from building to building, staying in the shadows and avoiding open spaces where he might be spotted, when he'd seen the school and hoped it might contain useful supplies or at least a safe place to rest and plan his next move. He'd entered through a broken window on the ground floor, moving carefully through hallways lined with children's artwork that seemed obscenely cheerful in the current circumstances. When he encountered Dr. Caldwell and the two children in the school's main office, his first instinct was suspicion, but the woman's calm demeanor and medical credentials quickly established her credibility. The children were obviously in need of protection, and despite his own fear and uncertainty, Neil found himself accepting responsibility for their safety. None of them knew it yet, but they were among the last uninfected humans left in central Anchorage, and their survival would depend on their ability to work together despite being complete strangers thrown together by circumstance. Dr. Caldwell quickly took charge of their immediate medical needs, checking the children for injuries and signs of infection while Neil secured the office and tried to establish communication with the outside world. The school's radio equipment was still functional, but the emergency frequencies carried only static or automated warnings about the quarantine. The cell phone towers were apparently down, and landline service had been discontinued. They were effectively cut off from any official help, left to survive on their own resources in a city that had become a hunting ground for creatures that had once been human. Outside the school, Anchorage burned under the October sky, and the dead walked among the flames with purpose that no longer included memory, compassion, or any trace of their former humanity. The four survivors had found each other through chance and desperation, but they would need much more than luck to survive what was coming. The infection was spreading beyond the city limits despite the military quarantine, and the world they'd known was dying along with the civilization that had created it. Their only hope lay in staying together, staying alive, and finding a way out of the trap that Alaska's largest city had become. The group spent 3 harrowing days in Willowcrest Elementary learning the brutal new rules of survival in a world where death had become a revolving door and humanity's apex predator status had been violently revoked by creatures that had once shared their morning coffee and evening news. The infected moved in patterns that Neil's analytical mind began to catalog with obsessive precision, noting that they were slower during the daylight hours, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated as if the virus that animated their corpses struggled against some biological imperative tied to circadian rhythms. But as darkness fell each evening, they became more aggressive, more purposeful in their movements, hunting with a coordination that suggested the infection was evolving beyond simple reanimation into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. They were drawn to noise and movement like moths to flame, their hearing apparently enhanced by whatever neurological changes had occurred during their transformation, but they seemed to have little memory of their former lives or the complex problem-solving abilities that had once made humans the dominant species on Earth. Dr. Caldwell considered this a mercy, as it meant they retained no emotional connections to their past selves, no recognition of family members or friends that might complicate the moral calculus of survival. A zombie that had once been someone's mother or husband was simply a threat to be avoided or neutralized, without the psychological burden of lost relationships weighing on the survivors' consciences. Neil emerged as their reluctant leader during those first critical days, his background in financial analysis and risk management translating surprisingly well to the task of planning routes through the urban maze that Anchorage had become. He spent hours studying street maps and satellite images on his phone while the battery lasted, memorizing alternate routes and identifying potential safe houses, supply caches, and strategic choke points that could be used to funnel or avoid the growing hordes of infected that roamed the city like packs of rabid wolves. His methodical approach to problem-solving provided stability and direction for a group that might otherwise have been paralyzed by the magnitude of their situation. Dr. Caldwell provided medical expertise that proved invaluable when they encountered other survivors who'd been injured during their own escapes from the chaos, her steady hands and professional calm serving as an anchor of rationality in a world that seemed determined to drive them all insane. She also possessed a clinical understanding of the infection that helped them develop protocols for avoiding contamination, recognizing early symptoms in other survivors, and making the difficult decisions about when someone had progressed beyond help. Her medical bag contained supplies that were becoming more precious than gold in a city where hospitals had become charnel houses and pharmacies had been looted or abandoned. Danny and Jules, despite their youth, proved remarkably adaptable to their new circumstances, their flexible minds accepting the changed reality with a resilience that their adult companions found both inspiring and heartbreaking. Their small size allowed them to scout areas that would be too dangerous for adults, crawling through ventilation systems and squeezing through gaps and barriers to gather intelligence about infected movements and safe passages. They developed a system of hand signals that allowed silent communication during dangerous reconnaissance missions, and their sharp young eyes often spotted threats or opportunities that the adults missed entirely. The group made their base in Big Mart, an abandoned sporting goods store on Northern Lights Boulevard whose security gates and reinforced windows provided some protection against the infected while offering access to camping equipment, freeze-dried food, and hunting gear that would prove essential for their eventual escape from the city. The store's location near several major roads also made it an ideal staging area for planning their departure, though the constant sound of shuffling footsteps and inhuman moans from the parking lot served as a constant reminder that they were surrounded by enemies who never tired, never stopped hunting, and never forgot the scent of living flesh. From their makeshift fortress, they planned their escape with the thoroughness of military strategists preparing for a campaign against overwhelming odds. The highways were still blocked by military checkpoints that had either been abandoned or overrun, but Neil had studied topographical maps obsessively and believed there might be another way out of the city. Backroads and hiking trails that could lead them south towards Seward, where the ocean might provide opportunities for escape by boat, or at least answers about whether the infection had spread beyond Alaska's borders to consume the entire world. Their first major test came when they attempted to reach Neil's apartment building to retrieve supplies and personal items that might prove useful during their journey south. The residential areas of Anchorage had become hunting grounds for the infected, who seemed to cluster around former population centers with an instinct that suggested they retained some buried memory of where humans had once lived in large numbers. The infected appeared to be developing pack behaviors, moving in loose groups that covered more ground and could overwhelm individual survivors through sheer numbers rather than speed or strength. The group moved in a formation that Neil had devised after studying military tactics online, with himself taking point as the navigator and primary decision-maker, Dr. Caldwell covering their rear with a pistol she'd reluctantly learned to use, and the children positioned between them where they could be protected while still serving as scouts and early warning systems. They traveled light but carried everything they might need for a hasty retreat, including first aid supplies, emergency food, and weapons that ranged from hunting knives to a compound bow that Jules had surprised everyone by demonstrating considerable skill with during their practice sessions in the sporting goods store. The journey to Neil's apartment building should have taken 20 minutes by car under normal circumstances, but navigating on foot through a city full of infected required constant detours and hiding places, turning a simple trip into a 6-hour ordeal that tested every survival skill they'd developed. They moved from shadow to shadow, using abandoned vehicles as cover and timing their movements to avoid the roving groups of infected that seemed to patrol the streets with increasing organization. The infection was clearly evolving, adapting to the urban environment and developing hunting strategies that made them more dangerous with each passing day. They nearly didn't make it when a horde of infected, at least 50 strong, had surrounded Neil's building like a siege army laying claim to a fortress. Jules spotted them first, her sharp eyes catching movement in the shadows between buildings where the infected had learned to wait for prey, and her whispered warning allowed the group to retreat to a safe distance before they were detected. The infected weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore, they were positioning themselves strategically, setting up ambushes and coordinating their movements in ways that suggested a collective intelligence emerging from the viral network that connected their damaged brains. The sight of so many infected working together challenged everything they thought they understood about the creatures that had once been their neighbors and fellow citizens. These weren't mindless zombies stumbling around randomly, they were becoming something new, something that retained enough intelligence to plan and coordinate while being driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh. The implications were terrifying, suggesting that the infection was not just reanimating corpses but creating a new species with its own evolutionary advantages and survival strategies. From their hiding place behind an overturned delivery truck, they observed the infected for over an hour, taking notes on their behavior patterns and trying to understand the logic behind their positioning. The creatures had stationed themselves at every entrance and exit to Neil's building, with smaller groups patrolling the surrounding area in patterns that covered all possible escape routes. It was a level of tactical thinking that suggested the infection was accessing and repurposing parts of the human brain that controlled strategic planning and problem-solving, creating predators that combined human intelligence with inhuman hunger and persistence. That night, huddled in the sporting goods store with the infected still prowling the streets outside, they made the decision that would define the rest of their journey. Anchorage was lost, transformed into a feeding ground for creatures that were becoming more dangerous and organized with each passing day. Their only hope lay in the wilderness beyond the city limits, where the infection might not have spread or where they might find other survivors who'd managed to establish safe communities away from the urban centers where the virus thrived on population density. The decision to leave wasn't made lightly, as it meant abandoning everything they'd known and venturing into the Alaskan wilderness during the approach of winter, when temperatures would drop to levels that could kill them as efficiently as any infected creature. But staying in Anchorage meant certain death, either from the infected or from starvation, as the city's resources were depleted and its infrastructure continued to collapse. They would begin their journey south on the Seward Highway at first light, carrying everything they could manage and hoping that the road would lead them to safety rather than simply delivering them to a different form of death in the frozen wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the city's borders. The sporting goods store had provided them with cold weather gear and camping equipment, but surviving an Alaskan winter on foot would require more than equipment. It would require luck, determination, and the kind of courage that emerges only when all other options have been exhausted and death becomes preferable to surrender. The Seward Highway stretched 127 miles from Anchorage to the coastal town of Seward, winding through some of Alaska's most breathtaking and unforgiving terrain like a ribbon of asphalt connecting civilization to the raw wilderness that had claimed the lives of countless explorers, hunters, and adventurers over the past century. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a scenic drive through mountain passes and along glacier-carved valleys, with roadside pullouts offering spectacular views of Tennigin Arm and the surrounding peaks of the Chugach National Forest. Now, it represented their only viable path to possible salvation, or alternatively, a frozen grave in the wilderness where their bones would join those of countless others who'd underestimated the lethal beauty of the last frontier. They left the city at dawn on October 15th, traveling light but armed with everything the sporting goods store could provide after 3 days of careful preparation and inventory. Neil carried a Remington hunting rifle he barely knew how to use, along with 2 boxes of ammunition and a detailed topographical map of the highway route marked with potential shelter locations and water sources. Dr. Caldwell had traded her medical bag for a more practical backpack containing essential supplies and a Glock 19 pistol that felt uncomfortably heavy in her hands despite hours of practice in the store's basement. Even Danny and Jules carried small packs loaded with emergency food, water purification tablets, and sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, their young faces set with determination that seemed heartbreaking in children who should have been worrying about homework and playground politics rather than survival in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Every step took them further from the familiar horror of urban infected toward the unknown dangers of the Alaskan wilderness, where death could come from exposure, avalanche, wild animals, or simply getting lost in terrain that stretched for hundreds of miles without any sign of human habitation. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and their breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry atmosphere, a constant reminder that they were racing against time as well as the infected hordes that might be following their trail south from the ruined city. The first 20 miles proved to be the most psychologically challenging, as abandoned vehicles littered the highway like metallic tombstones marking the graves of families who'd attempted to flee during the initial outbreak only to be overtaken by the spreading infection or mechanical failures that had left them stranded and vulnerable. Many of the cars had their doors torn off or windows smashed inward, with dark stains on the upholstery and dashboard that told stories of desperate final moments when escape had become impossible and hope had died along with the occupants. The infected wandered aimlessly between the vehicles like lost souls condemned to eternal searching, their movements random and purposeless during the daylight hours but still dangerous enough to require constant vigilance and careful navigation. The group learned to move in complete silence during these early miles, communicating through hand signals and staying low behind the abandoned vehicles while plotting courses that would take them around the largest concentrations of infected without exposing them to attack from multiple directions. They discovered that the creatures were drawn to the highway itself, perhaps retained some buried instinct that associated roads with human activity, clustering around the abandoned vehicles and occasionally following the asphalt for miles before wandering off into the surrounding forest where they presumably continued their mindless hunt for living prey. At Bird Creek, 37 miles south of Anchorage, they encountered other survivors for the first time since leaving their urban fortress, and the meeting nearly ended in violence before cooler heads prevailed and established that neither group posed an immediate threat to the other. Jerry and Megan Thompson, a middle-aged couple from Eagle River who'd been married for 23 years and had raised 2 children who were now presumably dead or infected, had been trapped in their Winnebago motorhome when the outbreak began and had spent the intervening days slowly making their way south while avoiding the infected and conserving their limited supplies of food and fuel. Emma Rodriguez, a park ranger from the Chugach National Forest who'd been conducting routine wildlife surveys when the world ended, had discovered the Thompsons 2 days earlier when their RV had broken down near the Bird Creek campground. Her knowledge of wilderness survival and intimate familiarity with the local terrain made her an invaluable addition to any group attempting to traverse the dangerous highway, and her official position with the National Park Service gave her access to emergency caches and communication equipment that might prove crucial for long-term survival in the harsh environment they were entering. The 3 survivors had found each other through a combination of desperation and mutual need, forming an alliance based on shared resources and complementary skills rather than personal compatibility or long-term planning. Jerry possessed mechanical expertise that had kept their RV functional despite the challenging conditions, while Megan had proven surprisingly adept at scavenging supplies from abandoned vehicles and campsites along their route. Emma's ranger training provided essential knowledge about weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and the location of emergency shelters maintained by the Forest Service for stranded hikers and hunters. The expanded group provided both increased security and additional complications that Neil hadn't anticipated when planning their escape from Anchorage. More people meant better defensive capabilities and a larger pool of skills and knowledge to draw upon during emergencies, but it also meant more noise, more visible movement, and more complex decision-making processes when quick action was required for survival. 6 adults and 2 children represented a significant logistical challenge for movement through terrain where stealth and speed might mean the difference between life and death, and the group dynamics would require careful management to prevent personality conflicts from undermining their collective survival. Neil found himself mediating between different survival philosophies and approaches to risk management while trying to maintain forward momentum toward their ultimate destination of Seward, where they hoped to find either boat transportation away from the infected zones or at least a defensible position where they could establish a more permanent base of operations. Jerry favored a cautious approach that prioritized safety over speed, arguing that they should establish secure campsites and move only during optimal conditions when visibility was good and infected activity was minimal. Emma advocated for rapid movement through the most dangerous areas, using her knowledge of the terrain to identify shortcuts and alternate routes that would minimize their exposure to both infected and environmental hazards. Dr. Caldwell focused on medical preparedness and the health needs of the group, particularly the children who were showing signs of stress and exhaustion that could compromise their immune systems and make them more vulnerable to both infection and environmental threats. Megan struggled with depression and grief over the loss of her adult children, whose fate remained unknown but was presumed tragic given the scope of the outbreak in populated areas. The psychological burden of survival was proving as challenging as the physical demands, and maintaining group morale would be essential for their long-term success. As October deepened toward November and the first major snowfall of the season began to accumulate on the highway, the weather became as much an enemy as the infected creatures that continued to shadow their progress south. Snow fell more frequently and accumulated faster than the autumn sun could melt it, creating slippery conditions that made walking treacherous and reduced visibility to dangerous levels during storms. Temperatures dropped below freezing every night, requiring careful attention to shelter and warmth to prevent hypothermia and frostbite that could incapacitate or kill group members who couldn't be easily replaced or evacuated to medical facilities. They were racing against multiple threats simultaneously: the infected hordes that might be following their trail from Anchorage, the approaching Alaskan winter that could trap them in the wilderness without adequate shelter or supplies, and their own limited resources of food, ammunition, and cold weather gear that would eventually be exhausted if they couldn't reach a safe destination or establish reliable supply lines. Each day brought new challenges and difficult decisions about route selection, resource allocation, and risk management that tested their individual skills and collective resolve. The highway itself became both their lifeline and their greatest vulnerability, providing a clear path toward potential salvation while also exposing them to infected that used the same route for their own mindless migrations. They learned to travel parallel to the road when possible, using the forest cover for concealment while maintaining visual contact with the asphalt ribbon that served as their primary navigation reference. The abandoned vehicles continued to provide both resources and hazards, offering occasional supplies of food, clothing, and equipment while also serving as potential ambush sites where infected might be lurking in wait for unwary survivors. By the time they reached the halfway point of their journey, approximately 60 miles south of Anchorage near the entrance to Chugach State Park, they had developed efficient routines for camp setup, guard duties, and resource management that maximized their chances of survival while minimizing their exposure to the various threats that surrounded them. But they had also begun to understand that reaching Seward would only be the beginning of their challenges, not the end, and that survival in this new world would require constant adaptation and the willingness to make increasingly difficult moral choices about who lived, who died, and what prices they were willing to pay for their continued existence in a reality that had abandoned all pretense of fairness or justice. The Alaskan winter arrived early and with the brutal efficiency of a predator that had been stalking its prey across the northern latitudes, bringing temperatures that plummeted to 20 degrees below zero and winds that cut through even the best cold-weather gear like invisible knives designed to strip away body heat and hope in equal measure. By the time the expanded group of 7 survivors reached Tenigan Pass, 63 miles south of Anchorage and still over 60 miles from their destination of Seward, they were traveling through a landscape transformed by snow and ice into something that belonged more to another planet than to the familiar world they had known before the outbreak turned their neighbors into flesh-hungry monsters and their home into a frozen wasteland where survival measured itself in hours rather than days. The infected seemed less active in the extreme cold, their movements becoming sluggish and uncoordinated as the virus that animated their corpses struggled against the biological reality that human bodies were simply not designed to function in subarctic temperatures without the conscious behaviors that kept living people alive in such conditions. But while this provided some relief from the constant threat of attack, the weather presented new challenges that tested their survival skills to the absolute limit and forced them to make increasingly desperate decisions about resource allocation, route selection, and the moral calculus of who lived and who died when resources became insufficient to sustain the entire group. Emma Rodriguez's ranger training proved invaluable as the group learned to navigate icy terrain that could kill them as efficiently as any infected creature, her knowledge of avalanche conditions and weather patterns serving as their primary defense against environmental hazards that claim the lives of experienced outdoorsmen and women every year even under normal circumstances. She taught them to read the subtle signs of unstable snow formations, to identify the warning sounds of shifting ice and wind patterns that preceded deadly avalanches, and to recognize the early symptoms of hypothermia and frostbite that could progress from minor discomfort to life-threatening emergency within minutes in the savage cold. Jerry and Megan Thompson's Winnebago had provided mobile shelter and a reliable source of heat during the early stages of their journey, but the motorhome finally succumbed to the harsh conditions near Portage Glacier when the engine seized due to fuel contamination and mechanical stress that their limited repair capabilities couldn't address. The breakdown forced them to abandon the vehicle and continue on foot, carrying only what they could manage while maintaining the mobility necessary to stay ahead of both infected and weather systems that could trap and kill them if they remained stationary for too long. Dr. Caldwell found herself treating an increasing number of cold-related injuries as the group pushed themselves beyond their physical limits in an effort to reach some form of permanent shelter before the worst of the winter storms made travel impossible. Frostbite became a constant concern, requiring daily inspection of fingers, toes, and exposed facial features that showed the telltale signs of tissue damage that could progress to gangrene and amputation if not treated promptly. Hypothermia was an even greater threat, creeping up on exhausted survivors whose bodies could no longer generate sufficient heat to maintain core temperatures necessary for survival. Danny and Jules, despite their youth and smaller body mass that should have made them more vulnerable to the cold, showed remarkable resilience and adaptation to the harsh conditions. Their young metabolisms seemed better able to adjust to the caloric demands of cold weather survival, and their smaller size allowed them to conserve body heat more efficiently while requiring less food and water to maintain their energy levels. They often served as the group's early warning system for both infected activity and dangerous weather conditions, their sharp eyes and acute hearing providing advance notice of threats that the adults might miss due to fatigue or sensory degradation caused by the extreme cold. The group faced their most severe test at Portage Valley, where a massive horde of infected, numbering in the hundreds, had been drawn to the residual warmth of the abandoned visitor center's geothermal heating systems that continued to function despite the collapse of civilization. The infected had apparently followed heat signatures and structural vibrations to the location, creating a concentration of undead creatures that blocked the most direct route south and forced the survivors to consider a dangerous detour through unstable glacier terrain where the risk of avalanche, ice falls, and hidden crevasses could prove as deadly as any encounter with the infected. Getting past the horde required a route that took them across the face of Portage Glacier itself, following a path that Emma had used during her ranger duties but never under winter conditions when the ice was unstable and the weather could change from clear skies to whiteout blizzard conditions within minutes. The glacier presented a maze of crevasses and ice formations that could shift without warning, creating deadly traps for the unwary or unlucky, and the altitude made the already brutal cold even more dangerous for people whose bodies were already stressed by weeks of inadequate nutrition and constant physical exertion. The crossing took 2 full days of careful navigation and constant vigilance, with the group roped together to prevent anyone from falling into hidden crevasses that could swallow a person completely and provide no opportunity for rescue. The blue-white ice created an otherworldly landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, with formations that seemed to glow with their own internal light while concealing deadly hazards beneath surfaces that appeared solid and safe but could collapse under the weight of a single footstep. It was during this crossing that they lost Jerry Thompson, the first member of their group to die not from infected attack or obvious environmental hazard but from the simple cruel randomness of a world that no longer provided any guarantee of fairness or justice. A concealed crack in the glacier ice gave way beneath his weight without warning, sending him plummeting into an abyss of blue-white death that swallowed his final scream and left only an irregular hole in the ice to mark where he had been walking just seconds before. The rope that should have saved him snapped under the sudden shock load, its fibers weakened by repeated freeze-thaw cycles and the constant stress of their journey. Jerry's death wasn't heroic or meaningful in any narrative sense. It was simply the random cruelty of a universe that had abandoned all pretense of caring about human survival or the bonds of love and friendship that connected people to each other and to life itself. His wife Megan's grief threatened to destroy the group's cohesion and morale, her anguished cries echoing across the glacier and potentially alerting infected to their location, while her refusal to continue moving put everyone at risk of exposure and hypothermia. Neil found himself making the brutal calculation that her emotional needs had to be balanced against the survival requirements of the entire group, including 2 children whose lives depended on maintaining forward momentum toward shelter and safety. The moral complexity of Jerry's death and its aftermath forced the survivors to confront the psychological reality that survival in their new world would require them to make increasingly difficult choices about resource allocation, risk management, and the fundamental question of whether individual lives could be sacrificed for the greater good of group survival. The infected had stripped away the comfortable illusions of civilization and forced them to operate according to the harsh mathematics of survival, where sentiment and emotional attachment could become deadly luxuries that the living could no longer afford. Megan's grief gradually transformed into a grim determination to honor Jerry's memory by ensuring that his sacrifice, however random and meaningless, wouldn't be wasted through the deaths of the remaining survivors. She threw herself into the practical tasks of survival with an intensity that bordered on obsession, checking and rechecking equipment, monitoring weather conditions, and pushing herself beyond reasonable limits in an effort to prove that she could still contribute to the group's chances of reaching safety. Her transformation from grieving widow to hardened survivor illustrated the psychological adaptations that were necessary for continued existence in a world that had abandoned all mercy and forgiveness. As they approached the final stretches of their journey toward Whittier, which had become their new destination since Seward seemed too far to reach before the worst winter storms made travel impossible, they realized that they were no longer just survivors thrown together by circumstance and desperation. They had become a family forged by shared trauma, mutual dependence, and the terrible intimacy that comes from watching each other face death on a daily basis while maintaining the will to continue living despite the overwhelming evidence that the world no longer wanted them to exist. The bonds that connected them had been tested by Jerry's death and strengthened by their collective response to loss, creating relationships that were deeper and more meaningful than most people ever experienced during normal times when death was an abstract concept rather than a constant companion. Whatever waited for them in Whittier, whether salvation or simply another form of death, they would face it together as a unit that had been forged in the crucible of apocalypse and emerged stronger than the sum of its individual parts, ready to continue the fight for survival that had become their primary purpose and their only remaining connection to hope. Whittier, Alaska, population 270 on the best of days, was accessible by only one road connection to the outside world, a 2.5-mile tunnel through the Chugach Mountains that served both automobile traffic during designated hours and the Alaska Railroad on a schedule that had once seemed inconvenient but now represented their only hope for salvation. For most of its isolated history, this geographic bottleneck had been considered a minor inconvenience for residents and visitors who had to time their arrivals and departures around the tunnel's operating schedule. But in a world overrun by infected creatures driven by an insatiable hunger for living flesh, that same isolation might represent the difference between extinction and survival for the last remnants of human civilization in south-central Alaska. The approach to the tunnel entrance through the snow-covered landscape of Portage Valley felt like a pilgrimage toward either salvation or damnation, with the 6 surviving members of their group moving through terrain that had been transformed by winter into something alien and hostile. Neil led the procession with the grim determination of a man who had accepted leadership responsibilities he never wanted and discovered reserves of strength and decisiveness that had remained dormant during his previous life as a financial analyst processing quarterly reports in a climate-controlled office building. Behind him, Dr. Caldwell monitored the physical and psychological condition of their small band, her medical training constantly alert for signs of hypothermia, exhaustion, or the early stages of infection that could turn any of them into the enemy they had been fleeing for weeks. Emma Rodriguez used her ranger expertise to navigate the treacherous final miles of their journey, reading weather patterns and avalanche conditions with the skill of someone who had spent years learning to survive in terrain that killed unprepared visitors with casual indifference. Megan Thompson had transformed her grief over Jerry's death into a fierce protective instinct that focused primarily on Danny and Jules, the 2 children whose survival had become her primary reason for continuing to fight against the overwhelming odds that seemed determined to claim them all. The kids themselves had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that seemed characteristic of their generation, treating their post-apocalyptic existence as a challenging game that required constant vigilance and creative problem-solving rather than a nightmare that had destroyed everything they had previously understood about the world. The tunnel entrance loomed ahead like the mouth of some ancient beast carved from living rock, its concrete portal dark and silent against the white backdrop of snow-covered mountains. No guards were visible at the checkpoint that had once controlled access between the tunnel's automobile and railroad schedules. No barriers blocked their approach, and no signs of life or death indicated whether the small community beyond had managed to survive the catastrophe that had consumed the rest of Alaska's population centers. The absence of any obvious threats was somehow more unsettling than the presence of infected would have been, suggesting either complete abandonment or a level of organization and security that had successfully eliminated all visible evidence of the chaos that had engulfed the outside world. Neil made the decision to proceed into the tunnel despite the risks involved in entering an enclosed space where retreat might be impossible if they encountered infected or hostile survivors on the other side. They had traveled too far and endured too much suffering to turn back based on uncertainties and hypothetical dangers, and the approaching winter storms would make any alternative shelter inadequate for long-term survival. The tunnel represented their last realistic chance to reach a defensible position before the worst of the Alaskan winter made travel impossible and condemned them to slow death by exposure in the wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. Emma took point for the tunnel reconnaissance, her ranger training and familiarity with underground environments making her the logical choice for advanced scouting in conditions where visibility was limited and acoustic properties could distort sound in ways that made it difficult to identify the source and nature of potential threats. The tunnel's interior was a monument to engineering achievement, with massive concrete walls and a curved ceiling that had been designed to withstand the geological pressures of the mountain above while accommodating both vehicular traffic and railroad operations on the same roadbed through a scheduling system that had once seemed primitive but now appeared brilliantly simple in its mechanical reliability. Their footsteps echoed in the concrete tube with a hollow sound that seemed to announce their presence to anyone or anything that might be waiting on the other side. But the alternative of remaining silent would have required them to move so slowly that they risked being trapped in the tunnel if weather conditions deteriorated or if infected creatures entered from either end. The decision to maintain normal walking speed represented another of the calculated risks that had become routine parts of their survival strategy, balancing immediate tactical considerations against longer-term strategic objectives while accepting that perfect safety was an illusion that no longer existed in their new reality. Halfway through the tunnel's length, they heard the distant rumble of approaching machinery that initially triggered fight-or-flight responses until they recognized the distinctive sound of a diesel locomotive moving through the tunnel from the Whittier direction. The headlight appeared first as a pinpoint of illumination in the darkness ahead, growing larger and brighter as the train approached their position at a speed that suggested normal operations rather than emergency evacuation or desperate flight from pursuing threats. As the locomotive drew closer, they could distinguish human figures in the windows of the passenger cars, faces pressed against glass and expressions of curiosity and recognition rather than the vacant hunger that characterized the infected. The train came to a complete stop beside their small group, and the conductor, a weathered man in his 60s whose name tag identified him as Captain Morrison, opened the door with a genuine smile that none of them had seen directed toward them in weeks of constant danger and uncertainty. His friendly demeanor and calm professionalism suggested that normal human social interactions were still possible in some locations, that civilization hadn't been completely eradicated by the outbreak, and that their long journey through the frozen wasteland might actually lead to safety rather than simply another form of death in a different location. "Welcome to Whittier," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had been hoping to encounter survivors rather than dreading the possibility of infected passengers. "We've been monitoring radio frequencies and hoping that some folks might make it through from Anchorage. You people look like you could use some hot food, warm beds, and maybe a chance to rest somewhere safe for a while." His words seemed almost too good to be true after their weeks of constant vigilance and deprivation, but the genuine concern in his expression and the presence of other apparently healthy passengers suggested that their ordeal might finally be approaching an end. The small community of Whittier had indeed managed to survive the outbreak that had devastated larger population centers, their geographic isolation finally working in their favor rather than against them for the first time in the town's history. The tunnel had been sealed at the first reports of infection spreading through Anchorage, turning their island community into an impregnable fortress that no infected creature could reach without first passing through 2.5 miles of concrete tube that could be easily monitored and defended by a small number of armed residents. The decision to close the tunnel had been controversial among some residents who had family and friends trapped in Anchorage, but it had proven to be the critical factor in their survival when every other community in the region had been overrun. The town's population had actually increased slightly during the crisis as railroad employees, tunnel maintenance workers, and a few lucky travelers had been stranded on the safe side when the tunnel was sealed, bringing additional skills and resources that had helped the community become more self-sufficient and defensible. They had established contact with other isolated communities throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest through ham radio networks, confirming that the infection had been widespread but not necessarily global in scope, and that organized resistance and recovery efforts were beginning to emerge in locations that had managed to maintain quarantine protocols during the initial outbreak. As Neil's group was transported through the tunnel aboard the warm, comfortable passenger train, they began to process the magnitude of what they had endured and accomplished during their journey from the ruins of Anchorage to the safety of Whittier. They had lost friends and witnessed horrors that would haunt their dreams for years to come, but they had also discovered reserves of courage, determination, and mutual loyalty that had enabled them to survive conditions that had killed thousands of other people who had been equally deserving of life and equally desperate to reach safety. The town of Whittier existed primarily within a single structure, the Beejich Towers, a 14-story apartment building that had been constructed during the Cold War to house military personnel and their families but now served as home to most of the town's civilian population. The building's concrete construction and centralized design made it easy to defend and heat efficiently, while its self-contained facilities including a school, medical clinic, and community center provided everything necessary for long-term survival during the extended isolation that their situation required. The building had become a vertical village where neighbors knew each other by necessity and cooperation was essential for everyone's continued survival. Danny and Jules found other children to play with for the first time since the outbreak began, their laughter echoing through the building's corridors as they rediscovered the simple joy of childhood games and friendships that didn't involve life or death decisions or constant awareness of mortal danger. Dr. Caldwell established a medical clinic in the building's former military medical facilities, treating minor injuries and illnesses while helping to establish protocols for screening new arrivals and maintaining the health of the existing population. Emma began organizing scouting missions to establish contact with other survivor communities and assess the possibility of expanding their safe zone to include additional resources and territory. Megan Thompson found purpose in helping to coordinate the community's resource management and distribution systems, her grief over Jerry's death channeled into ensuring that the practical needs of daily survival were met efficiently and fairly. Her organizational skills and attention to detail proved invaluable for maintaining the complex logistics required to keep their isolated community functioning despite limited resources and the constant uncertainty about long-term prospects for recovery and reconstruction. Neil discovered that survival was only the beginning of their challenges rather than the end of their ordeal, as the community faced the complex task of rebuilding not just physical infrastructure and supply chains but also the social institutions and cultural values that defined human civilization. The infected might still roam the ruins of Anchorage and other abandoned cities, but here in Whittier, life was finding ways to continue and even flourish despite the apocalyptic circumstances that had brought them together. Through the windows of Beejich Towers, they could see the tunnel that had brought them to safety, a concrete lifeline connecting the world that had been destroyed to the world that might yet be rebuilt from the ashes of the old order.